Hello, and welcome to this third session of the Constitution Unit's 2025 Summer Conference. The theme for the conference as a whole is Labour's constitutional agenda in office. But in this session, we're deviating slightly from that theme to look at a topic that is on many people's agendas, but not on that of the government, namely whether the first-past-the-post electoral system is sustainable in an era of multi-party politics. I'm Alan Renwick. I'm the Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'm your chair for this session. As you'll be aware, the grip of the two main parties over electoral politics in the UK has long been weakening. That is dramatically evident in the current polls and in the results of last month's local elections, but it's a pattern that has been developing for many decades. Labour and the Conservatives between them secured 96% of all votes cast back in 1955, but that had already fallen to 75% in the two elections of 1974. It was 65% in 2010, and last year it was just 57%. So in this panel, we're asking whether first past the post can still be justified in a multi-party era. What are the arguments for and against reform? What alternative systems might be considered? And with ministers saying they will maintain the status quo, is there any way reform could come about? To explore these matters, we're joined by a fantastic panel. Frances Foley is Deputy Director of Compass, a campaign group that works, at least according to its website, for a more equal, democratic and sustainable society. Peter Lamb is Labour MP for Crawley and is also a valued member of the Constitution Unit family, having worked here for a short time way back in 2008. And Rob Ford is a professor of political science at the University of Manchester and all-round elections guru. So thank you so much, Frances, Peter and Rob, for joining us today. Very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. The format of the panel will be very familiar to Constitution Unit regulars. Each of the speakers will have opening remarks of 5 minutes or so, after which we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. The questions will be gathered in this session by Tom Fleming, whom you can also see on your screen. So if you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please write it in the Q&A function here on Zoom. Tom will select a broad range of questions and read them out. And if you'd like to ask your question anonymously, you can just indicate that when you submit your question. Do note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded, and it will be posted online on the Constitution Unit website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So that's enough from me by way of introduction. Let's get into the substance. And Frances, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and hi, everyone. It's good to be here today. So I'm going to focus my remarks not on the kind of same old of questions around PR. I think a lot of the PR debate is very abstract. We rehearsed it a number of times, and frankly, I'm slightly bored of my own arguments, rehearsing why first past the post is bad and PR is good. So today I'm going to try and situate in its current context. I'm hoping I'm going to tee up Rob to do some of that later as well. But I will focus most of my remarks on questions for why, if you are within the current government or supportive of the current Labour Party, or just on the progressive side of politics in general, you might actually think that this is in your self-interest to change the system. And I'm going to start by saying that, all the arguments for why PR is just and true and fair, really the question behind it should be for people who want to defend the status quo. So from Rishi Sunak through to Nigel Farage through to Keir Starmer, we've heard again and again over the last few years that the politics is broken. And my contestation is it's not politics that's really broken, it's the systems and structures that underlie our politics that is broken. So I kind of think it's incumbent on people who protect and defend the status quo to say what's so good about it and why no other system could possibly do better. I want to be really clear that I'm not here to say that if we changed to a PR system that everything would be the land of milk and honey, that all our political problems would go away. But I am going to say something about how those problems might become more visible and more solvable and more able to be addressed under a PR system. So I'm going to make three basic arguments. One, and it's all about kind of the effects of first past the post on the substance of our politics and what we end up talking about, what we don't end up talking about, who we listen to and who we don't listen to. The first is a kind of small target argument I call small targets, high stakes. The second is about how the first past the post voting system is for the few and not the many. And the third is should be familiar to people about this idea that let's kill this argument stone dead that first past the post is about strength and stability. And in fact, my argument will be that it leads to wild political convulsions, which we've seen over the past few years. So as we know, our voting system kind of hides in plain sight. And it very much frames the national conversation. It also warps our perception of political behaviour, and to a large degree, it dictates the decisions of political leaders in a way that is not often visible in our national discourse. And the reason I start with small targets and high stakes is because obviously just before the election, in the run-up to the election, and increasingly now, you see how a lot of the critiques of the current Labour administration centre around the narrowness of their vision. This kind of idea that if you say nothing, project electability and competence and let your opponent lose, that will be the way to win elections. And in fact, part of my argument over the past year has been like, yes, that's absolutely right. Under the first past the post system, we are incentivized to say very little and wait for your opponent to fail. Now, of course, we've all seen the impacts then on our politics. I felt that the discourse around the last election was very narrow. It didn't feel like a lot of fresh ideas were being discussed. And it actually felt quite frustrating to a lot of the public if you look at the polling. And of course, it delivered Labour, as Alan said, this huge landslide majority. But of course, on 34% of the vote, it was the most disproportionate election in UK history. And winning under the system means that you don't really actually have to do the political work. I would say that we've got a government now who's in power without a particularly strong mandate. And I think the effects of that are visible on a day-to-day basis. Labour didn't have to really do a lot of the muscular work that they needed to win that argument with the public. They just had to say, we're not the other guys. And I think that's really bad for our politics. A lot of the time when we talk about PR, we talk about cooperation and collaboration between parties, but actually my argument here is about competition. We don't have enough competition in our politics, and that leaves us all poorer in terms of ideas and in fact what is delivered. It's true that also the last 5 Labour leaders never won a competitive election before they became Labour leader, by which I mean they were all ushered into safe seats, which is a particularity of first past the post, and meant that by the time they became Labour leader and tried to run for a general election, they never actually had to compete in a competitive election. I think that's worth bearing in mind. Secondly, the idea for the few, not the many. And what I mean by that is first past the post really pushes us towards an obsession with marginal voters. This can be seen in lots of ways. And of course, whilst focus groups are not a peculiarity of first past the post, we are more likely to hear of Workington Man and Stevenage Woman, and indeed the red and blue walls. Now, we've all seen those red and blue walls crumble over the last 5 years, but actually, first past the post has been holding them in place for a lot longer than that. And this breeds complacency. It produces kind of unnuanced political thinking, I would argue, and actually it's quite patronising. A lot of voters feel taken for granted in these seats, and they are. It also distorts our national conversation. For example, the Uxbridge by-election, where this was one swung on kind of 495 votes, if you remember, but actually it changed the whole conversation around our green agenda, around climate, around ULEZ on the basis of 495 votes. And it kind of lacks democratic integrity, I would say. So that's one argument why I think that it actually focuses on a very small number of seats and a very small number of voters. And finally, wild political convulsion. So I think first past the post in its current form blocks those healthy feedback loops that help parties understand how their policies are going down with the public. And of course, as I hope Rob will go on to show, we're living already in a multi-party democracy, but it's living within the cage of first past the post, and something's got to give. The suppression of the vote actually for a party like UKIP, who got 4.5 million votes in 2015, led, I would say, pretty much directly to the Brexit referendum. It allowed us to ignore a lot of voters' concerns and frustrations, which didn't come up in the first past the post system. I think that was both undemocratic and led to this wild, then kind of pressure cooker environment, which caused, swings like Brexit. And of course, a question on many people's minds will be this question of reform. And unfortunately, Rob, I'm going to use your absolutely brilliant analogy here of how the first past the post voting system has for a while acted as a sandbag for reform and now is acting as a springboard. Please say that again later, because I think it's one of the best analogies I've heard so far. And what this means is that the system works for you as long as it does, and then suddenly it doesn't. And when things change, they change rapidly. And this once again creates a lot of instability in our politics, but it also means that parties are caught on the hop. They're not fighting for the kind of broad representation. They're fighting for, once again, those small number of voters. And finally, I'll say, as I said, it's not about, it won't solve all of our political problems, but my argument would be we should bring reform into our system if a large number of voters want to vote reform, because firstly, just it's undemocratic to keep a party out of politics that has that much popular support. In other PR systems, you see parties of the far right coming into government and having to be contested with. And most importantly, that helps bring them into the political process, which is very important for a populist party who wants to claim that they're martyrs and outsiders. And that's the worst thing you can do, is block them out by a kind of technocratic fix. So finally, I'd say I think it's really in the interests of progressive parties and this Labour government to think about how first past the post incentivises us to do the wrong things. Labour would be in power more often. They would get fresher, more interesting ideas. They wouldn't create a cage for their own victory by having to fight on such a narrow agenda. And we would actually have the power and mandate to change things and transform things in this country, which we currently don't have the power to do. Very finally, the APPG in Parliament is the largest APPG, for fair votes, I should say, is the largest APPG in Parliament. That reflects the broader shift that the country has made. The Labour membership is now massively in favour of PR, and the public is too. And I think it's time that we took this seriously, because as long as we don't, our politics is just cheaper, poorer, and much narrower. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Francis. And Francis there challenged supporters of First Past the Post to make the case. And I'm guessing, Peter, that you might be just about to do that. So, Peter, go for it.
Hello. I mean, this is a debate that's been going on an incredibly long time. I found a Fabian pamphlet called The Case Against Proportional Representation, complaining that the left has been completely obsessed with this for 40 years. That pamphlet was published in 1924. It is something that we have gone on and on and on about for a very long time, at the cost of, I would argue, an awful lot of issues that matter far more to voters on the left than constitutional issues. I find constitutional issues fascinating, obviously, but it's not the kind of thing you find that electors really want to speak to on the doorstep at all. I should probably begin by saying that I'm not in charge of government policy, clearly, as a backbencher. I can purely give you my take on the situation and give you some insight into how I think the Labour leadership probably view it from where I am standing. And it probably won't come as a surprise to anyone that, I imagine it's what Nick said this morning, the Labour government has no real interest in bringing forward proportional representation for general elections. Actually, interestingly, no real interest in bringing it forward at any lower level either, despite the fact that the last Labour government brought it in for various different bodies. And actually, when it comes down to the Maltese and the PCC, that was only recently reversed. But very interestingly, there doesn't seem to be any desire to change it at that level either. It shouldn't be a surprise as to why governments that are in office support first past the post. If you can win an election on first past the post, it gives you an enormous additional number of MPs. It enables you to actually, by yourselves, set the agenda. So any party that's in a position where they can secure that kind of boost is going to want to maintain that system. It's kind of one of those inevitabilities that means that regardless of which of the major parties is in office, I find it very hard to imagine a scenario where any party is going to give this up, even as some people have suggested, as a stop to a coalition partner. Why would you give up forever an opportunity for office for 5 years? The argument around a progressive majority has been made an awful lot. And can I say, it's not a great argument to be starting out with to say that we should be changing electoral systems because one party stands to benefit, particularly from them. Electoral systems should be based upon higher principles, I'd argue, than whether or not one party benefits from that system. But when you look through the numbers historically, I simply don't see that evidence that there would have been a consistent progressive majority since the Second World War if there had been PR. And the chief reason for this is that people choose to ignore two things when it comes to trying to make that case. The first of which is to say that there are no voters on the right outside of the Conservative Party. And of course there are always smaller parties all the way back to 45 that represented harder right viewpoints the Conservative Party could have tried to incorporate into their vote under those systems to secure a majority. In fact, if you add those all up, usually the right-wing bloc has always been larger than the left-wing bloc when there's been a right-wing government and vice versa. The system does seem to work largely. The other aspect is the belief that the Lib Dems would always go into coalition with Labour, something which as of yet has not happened at the national level. And at the local level, it's a very mixed picture. There's simply no reason to believe the Lib Dems will consistently go into Labour majority. In fact, they actually wouldn't necessarily have that choice. You'd need to have an identically balanced size grouping for the Lib Dems to by themselves put one party over than the other. They simply don't have that level of influence. To be honest, I blame David Marquand for putting this idea into an awful lot of people's heads on the left, and it's never really been properly demonstrated. There is no inherently fair electoral system. We know that when you come above two parties, Kenneth Arrow has demonstrated pretty thoroughly that every system has pros and cons in terms of representing people's viewpoints. There are different benefits, there are different costs. No doubt Rob Ford, who will be infinitely more aware of this research than I am, will be able to challenge some of this. But by and large, it does appear that every system has its pros and cons. What is the benefit of our system? Well, it does a number of things. The first of which is it maintains that constituency link. If you want to understand why more and more MPs are more and more rebellious, despite this idea that MPs by and large are increasingly compliant to the whip over time, the evidence is actually the contrary, that MPs are increasingly rebellious. I'd argue a very large part of that is because most MPs now have got quite a strong constituency link, something which is complained about quite a lot in the selection process by some media commentators. But the end result is that you genuinely want to do the best for your area and are prepared to go against the party line more frequently if you think it's going to be good for your community. And I think most voters would certainly be disappointed if they no longer had a named person in the system that they can approach. You certainly would struggle with two-tier MPs in terms of having, I know we have them in Scotland and in Wales in effect, but the impact diminishes some in terms of arguments around their legitimacy, and certainly affects people's workloads in a way that will disadvantage some relative to the other. You can address some of these things in systems like AMS, but ultimately, the more proportional you are, or the less of these things you can address, and the further you get away from them in resolving them with systems like AV, the less proportional you are. The argument is made that it's a panacea, but for all the things that we have raised as problems, in Europe they have those exact same sets of problems with PR systems. It never delivers the benefits when you look that are argued that it delivers to the UK or resolve the problems. The UK was built on a very simple basis, or at least our constitution has evolved on that basis, and that is to promote stability, and that's particularly important in a state that has as unitary as we are. This isn't Belgium. You haven't got federal systems, which state-based systems, which would enable you to perform effectively when you haven't got the overarching body. In the UK, people will severely suffer in the event that you lose that central power. And that means having a system that can deliver stability is important to people's quality of life in a way that it simply isn't in other systems. The other thing, of course, it keeps the agenda setting within the public domain. In the event that you have a hung parliament, you still have to form a coalition agreement to manage how that government's going to deliver on its policy agenda. That agenda never goes before the electorate. You have no clarity when you vote what the parties are actually going to deliver when they get into office in the way that you do with a manifesto. And that means you can't hold them to account on it as subsequent manifestos, and there's something to challenge them on. The last thing to say about first past the post is that, actually, I think we've already covered that point, but in terms of the overall system, there's a reason why the public, when they were given the opportunity with AV, voted it down. They simply cannot see the benefits in opting for more complex systems in which they're going to struggle to understand the outcome of those results. It compromises legitimacy. The last thing overall to say about PR, though, is that extremes do tend to struggle. And the point that was made earlier about sandbagging and stringboard is entirely true. When Reform hits 30% of the vote, all of a sudden they start giving the same benefits as other parties do in terms of gaining a majority. But for parties that want to suppress extreme classes, that means that we only have to get Reform back down below 30%. Whereas if you're dealing with a party that is able to secure a significant enough percentage that they can negotiate their way into government with the Conservative Party, you get those extreme voices in. I'll point out that through the history of fascist states rising, it's always the centre-right that puts those parties into office. It's not first past the post that's delivering fascist governments throughout history. And the risk we see in Europe now is that it has enabled them to get a foothold in systems. It gained us a foothold in the UK. All of these parties on the far right initially start getting elected under more proportional systems within the UK system. That gave them credibility, and that gave them a platform that enabled them to get into office in due course. And the one thing I'd really encourage people to see as part of the debate, and I'm sure no one will resort to this, but the last thing I'll say is the number of times I've got into debate in the Labour Party around the impact of PR in giving a springboard eventually to fascism in those systems, sooner or later, I end up hearing those voices try and make the case that the Tories are just as bad as fascist parties. That, I think, entirely devalues the nature of the debate. It undermines the reality that there is a big difference between centre-right and the hard right. And frankly, it acts as fascist apologism. So I very much hope that we're not going to get into that kind of territory.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. Lots of good arguments on both sides of this debate so far. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Peter, for making a very cogent case for the defence on first past the post. It's a bit of a flashback for me hearing about Arrow's impossibility theorem. I think the last time I contemplated that was when I tried to demonstrate it with a bowl of fruit in front of one young Dr. Alan Renwick. I still have vivid memories of that. I hope he doesn't. I won't do that now, incidentally. A few other things I won't do. I won't be comparing the Conservatives or Reform to fascism. I don't think that's a helpful way to conduct the critique of first past the post. I won't be arguing that there is one true electoral reform that will deliver every benefit under the sun. I don't believe that that is the case either. I think Peter is exactly right to say that any electoral system involves a trade-off of different costs and benefits, different desirable qualities. And so I want to focus my argument on what I consider to be some of the undesirable qualities of first past the post as it operates in Britain today, not necessarily as it always operated in the past, and how some kinds of electoral reform might help to mitigate those undesirable qualities. And the four that I will focus on are first past the post in 2025 for Westminster elections is unrepresentative, it is unstable, it is uncertain, and it is unfair. It is unrepresentative because 2/3 of the members of Parliament have been elected by 34% of those who turned out, which means less than a fifth of the public have elected 2/3 of the representatives of the Commons, whereas most of the other parties do not get a fair level of representation. The reason we have a universal franchise at all, which in the period that Peter mentioned where the Fabians were talking was still an issue that was up to debate, was a basic principle of equality. Every person should have equal influence on the first under the democratic political system. Every person does not have equal electoral influence under first past the post. Those who have the misfortune to live in safe seats have less influence. Those who have the misfortune to vote for smaller parties have less influence. It is by design an inegalitarian electoral system. It is unstable. Labour won 2/3 of the seats with 34% of the vote. If their vote had dropped a few percentage points more and reforms had rose a few percentage points more, that number would start to drop very rapidly. If we take County Durham's local council election last month, Reform got 34% of the vote and 2/3 of the seats there in an area where Labour had a majority for 100 years. If Reform had had 5 or 6 percentage points less, then it would potentially have been a Labour majority in that county council again. It is not a desirable quality of an electoral system that we can go from a situation where 2/3 of the legislators are elected to a situation where 2/3 of the legislators from a different party are elected based on a swing of small percentage points of the votes. This amplifies instability and volatility in a way that is both confusing for voters and harmful to good and stable government. It is uncertain, particularly now we're talking about five-party politics. We are going to have in future elections many more cases of what again we saw last month in May in many local council wards and in several of the mayoral elections, 3 or even 4 or even 5 parties all within a few percentage points of each other, in which what you are essentially doing in the election is rolling a dice and then accepting as the winner whatever face comes up on the dice. This again is not a particularly desirable quality of an electoral system because the 70 or 75% of voters whose dice face didn't come down can turn around and say, well, this doesn't seem particularly fair. It also produces an element of randomness in terms of who gets in. And it is unfair for all the reasons just given. It is unfair that voters in marginal seats get more of a voice than voters in safe seats. It is unfair that voters who vote for large parties get more influence than voters who vote for small parties. It is unfair that going from 25% to 35% of the vote can take you from a situation where you're basically ignored in Parliament to a situation where you run Parliament. These are not qualities that meet basic normative standards of fairness, basic kind of common sense, intuitive understandings of fairness. Now, in a situation like Britain in the 1950s, I think most of these negative qualities did not, in fact, obtain. The single one-line defence of first past the post that was often used and is often employed by John Curtis when he writes about this is strong government with strong accountability. We still have strong government. If you've got a government with 400 MPs, we're clearly still capable of getting strong governments out first past the post. We do not have strong accountability because the accountability process is now random and arbitrary. In a way that it wasn't when there was a clear single opposition party, as opposed to several different opposition parties of uncertain strength, splitting the vote in uncertain ways between them in different parts of the country. So those are the reasons I don't think it is any more a workable system. A few thoughts on what could be done to mitigate some of this and why Labour may want to consider it as well. I don't think necessarily that a pure list PR system is a good solution. I note what Peter said about mixed systems being a dilution of the constituency link. Well, yes, but the point is we're engaged in a game of trade-offs. I'm not going to pretend that my system is purely better than his system, and I'm not going to pretend that there aren't costs to change. But it's possible to design systems that maintain a constituency link but restore more proportionality. If we take Ireland, that I'm sure was on the mind of the Fabians in the 1920s, you have single transferable vote in constituencies, and the complaint of Irish politicians perennially is that they spend too much time in the constituency because the system incentivises them so strongly to be providing constituency service in order to secure the necessary local vote under that system. So there are variants of a more proportional system that can maintain or even strengthen constituency links if that's a quality of the system that you want to preserve. And I think there are good reasons to want to preserve it. I do think it's a good quality of our system. I also think another thing that is desirable in a reform is that it is at least somewhat familiar to voters in Britain. So I don't think moving to a pure national list PR system would be a desirable thing. I don't think it was necessarily a wise move of the Welsh Labour government to do that, for example, because that's rather alien to our political traditions. But we have mixed member proportional systems already in parts of this country. We're not Belgium, Peter, but we are a federal country, and we do have devolved legislatures, and they are, charged with quite a lot of stuff. So Scottish voters, Welsh voters, Northern Irish voters, they are familiar with mixed member systems. They're all, Scotland and Northern Ireland are also familiar with single transferable vote systems because that's what's used in their local elections. So we could move in the direction of that kind of a system that preserves elements of the system that we like and have a degree of familiarity to at least some voters while dealing with some of the undesirable qualities that I've mentioned. Final thought, why should Labour be talking about this when they've just won 400 seats? I mean, Peter's admirably honest about the turkeys don't go vote for Christmas element to all this. If you can win big majorities under first past the post, why do you want to reform it? Well, absolutely. Well, the reason is the instability, the uncertainty, and the risk that I mentioned. The current polling suggests that we could have another sort of majority to majority shift last time, just as we did last time. There's no guarantee that Labour will continue with a majority in office. But one thing that we can be fairly certain of, looking at the stated positions of all the parties that might be willing to work with Labour in a hung parliament, which is a fairly high probability outcome in the next general election. There's a range of situations in which that happens, again, because of fragmentation. They all want electoral reform. So Labour, if that ends up being the scenario that obtains, Labour has a choice right now, which is, do they want to frame and lead the debate over reform that they will inevitably have to have unless they just want to go into opposition? And incidentally, the answer to why would you agree to this as the price of staying in government is, one, you get to stay in government, and two, if you don't, somebody else will. So I don't necessarily buy that as a strong argument. So I do think a future Labour leader would probably be pretty sorely tempted to get into that discussion if it meant remaining in office and being able to deliver on many of the other things Labour governments would want to do. And therefore the choice is, do you allow others to frame that debate for you and be led by them, or do you frame the terms of the debate yourselves now and decide what is and isn't acceptable in terms of reform when that debate comes around? I would argue that it's strategically advantageous to take some clear positions on that now, so that you're not pushed into positions that are not comfortable for your party, even when that scenario obtains. And I think that's the point I'll end on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rob. So we have much to get into there. We will move to audience questions in a little while. So I can see we've had some fantastic questions already submitted, but if you haven't yet submitted your question, now is the time to do so, and we will go to those in a little bit. But let's first get some conversation going on the panel. I'm very much aware that Peter is slightly outnumbered on this panel, so I will do my best to be particularly tough in my questions towards Francis and Rob. I'll ask you all, give you all the chance to respond to each other's arguments in a little bit. I wanted first just to probe Rob's election expert brain on some of the kind of background to this just first, and understand the degree to which the framing that we have for this panel is adequate as a framing. So we've described this as the system, the electoral system in an era of multi-party politics. And I guess one counter argument to that framing would be that, yes, we now have many parties, but we still fundamentally have two bloc politics, as we had in the past. It's just that those blocs, whereas previously they were largely united under each of them under a single party banner, now they're rather more divided. And that means, firstly, that in practice at national level, it's going to be pretty predictable going forward what coalitions might form. And therefore, voters will actually have a fairly clear idea before they vote what the government possibilities are. And that concern about lack of accountability that you were expressing maybe isn't as strong as you were suggesting. And secondly, also at local level, we've seen a big rise in tactical voting, and which is in significant part, at least on the left, a shuffling of the supporters for those various parties behind the party that has the greatest chance of winning in their constituency. So that basically within each constituency, you have a movement in the direction of a two-party competition, even if at the national level you have a multi-party situation, such that although we maybe haven't quite got there yet, we're kind of moving in the direction of basically where Scotland largely is in most constituencies, where although there's a multi-party system in Scotland, most constituencies are clearly a battle between the SNP and whichever of the unionist parties has the greatest chance of winning. So in constituencies in England and Wales, we are maybe moving in the direction of a pattern where it's a kind of progressive versus conservative battle in each constituency. So going first to Rob on that, as I said, the person in command of the numbers, are we maybe exaggerating the extent to which we've moved to a multi-party mode of competition when we take those factors into account? And then I'd really be interested to hear the others' thoughts as well.
I mean, I think it's a good point, Alan. You're right. If we think of it as five-party politics, that we mostly have six parties in Scotland and Wales, they can be organised fairly straightforwardly into two fairly coherent blocks, left and right. We can be fairly predictable about how they're likely to behave at the moment. So that is one kind of argument against the sort of instability point I was making. However, I think that operating five-party politics under first past the post still comes with considerable price tags, even if we allow for the point that really those are five parties within blocks. Because the fact that there are five parties rather than two parties points to the fact that voters don't see this as a straightforward translation exercise into two blocks. If they did, they would all be voting Labour and the Conservatives. They clearly see relevant distinctions within their blocks. And that introduces a number of issues: complexity, instability, and opacity. Complexity because it's not entirely clear what you're voting for in terms of the bloc, and what you're voting for can be different depending upon the relative strengths of the parties in the bloc. I mean, compare a Conservative government with 250 MPs backed up by 50 Reform MPs versus a Reform government with 250 MPs backed up by 50 Conservative MPs. Those are going to be very different creatures. So the fact that they're all in one block does not mean that the block is a stable entity or outcome. But also, the party's behaviour will affect the degree to which the tactical voting that you're talking about will actually go on. Will they focus on trying to win tactical votes on their side? Will they focus on trying to be appealing to voters on their block? And thirdly, it means the degree to which voters are willing to engage in local tactical voting, or even aware that they need to do it, can have a really decisive impact on the outcome, and that's destabilizing. So, for example, last time around, it was clear that Reform voters didn't care at all if voting Reform cost Conservatives MPs. That could, of course, change. And if it changes, it doesn't mean that the Conservatives have necessarily become more popular. It just means that the Reform voters have become more willing to vote tactically. That, again, makes it rather hard, and this comes back to the higher principles Peter was talking about, to interpret what the election result means. If we're talking about shifts that are down to shifts in local tactical voting patterns because voters' information sets change, or their attraction sets change, or the way parties are behaving in terms of local campaigning changes, it becomes much harder to interpret the result in terms of a mandate or the endorsement of a particular manifesto, as opposed to a rather opaque set of machinations within a particular bloc. The advantage of a more proportional system is it brings those elements rather more out into the open in a rather more predictable and stable way. That would be my contention. Anyway.
Francis, do you want to pick up on any of those points or respond to anything else that's been said?
Yeah, I mean, I can only obviously hugely agree with Rob on that. Just to bring out 2 points, I really want to lift what Rob says there about the first past the post system being undiscerning. Like, it's really unclear what is being delivered here. And this is, we see, in 2017, we had historic high levels of tactical voting. And then every side sort of claimed that they won the election. The Tories just squeaked through. Corbyn said he won the argument. Lots of Greens and Labour Dems lent their votes to Labour. I know, because we're working on a tactical voting campaign. We have the stats to prove that. But that wasn't reflected in the huge number of votes for Labour. It just is very undifferentiated. And I just think this is the thicker argument about it being generally bad for democracy. Is democracy representative for democracy functions on the idea that people in their masses are being represented somehow through a party system. But when it goes through this black box of first past the post, and when people are being forced to tactically vote and hold their nose, we have very little idea of what people actually want. I always think this gets missed when we talk about other countries. I mean, for example, I went to a whole very interesting 2-hour-long conversation about the general election results in Germany, where I used to live for a long time, and so I've had the benefit of operating in a PR system as well politically, which was fascinating in terms of the differences. But that conversation just left entirely out of the picture. There was a whole conversation about turnout in Germany, how it was 82.5% of people turned out. We would kill for that kind of turnout in the UK, but very little about the link to that, for the fact that people knew that the way that they voted would be proportionally represented in Parliament. And I mean, that's the basic point that Rob is making in terms of this fair argument. And I just think that's sort of very hard to argue against. But then secondly, maybe something that kind of follows from what Rob says, but I think is under discussed when we talk about our multi-party system, is it's not just we need a PR system to reflect a multi-party reality. It's also what it might do politically for us. And for me, my argument about PR is always that it would also crack the system open in a way that would be healthy for our politics. So it's both to reflect changes that have already been made, as Rob went through in a lot of detail. We've moved from in the 1950s a two-party system, this binary approach, to the 5-party system and 7-party system, even you might say, that we see today. But it would also create more space. It would incentivize entrepreneurialism in politics. It would incentivize new people starting parties. It would, there's a lot of data to show that people participate more in party politics, in PR fit systems, because it makes sense. You can join the Green Party, you can actually vote for them in Germany, and it get reflected, and they might be in national government sometime, and then certainly in local government a lot. And I just want to put up this point finally on this question about the binary nature of politics, which maybe we've slightly under-discussed in this conversation, which is that, there's been a lot of conversation maybe in the past 5 to 10 years about the binary nature of a lot of our political debates, obviously very notably Brexit, but a lot of other debates that we've had as a society. And I think that is a reflection of the first past the point way of thinking. It suffuses our whole political conversation into thinking, are you for or against it? And you only have to look for the states to see a first past the post system, which has become incredibly dangerous for democracy itself, because when you have what I call the reverse incumbency factor, where it's basically like, I just don't want these guys, I want the other guys, which you've seen all across the world and is obviously a notable phenomenon through parties who were in power over COVID, you've really got to care about who your opponent is, right? So in the States, it really is Democrat or Republican. And the Democrats were looking down the barrel of another 4 years of somebody who wants to and is now attempting to dismantle a lot of the kind of systems of representative democracy we all come to rely on. Now, that might seem like an extremist argument, but actually, you only have to look to the UK to see some of those same patterns of thought being reflected. And I think that is the sort of danger of first past the post, is this binary thinking and thinking, okay, well, if it's not us, it's the other people. Well, what about all of the other options that are available in a multi-party system?
Thanks, Francis. Peter, I'm wondering if you're persuaded by any of the arguments that you're hearing here. You said at the start that this is a debate that has been going on for a very long time, but I think Rob and Francis have been pretty persuasive that the context has changed, and therefore the arguments potentially have also changed. Do you see any merit in the sorts of arguments that you've heard?
Not really. I mean, if we want to talk about unstable politics, the state politics of the 19th century, neither the Liberals nor the Tories could really form a coherent government for a long period of time because Irish politics meant there was a large block of Irish MPs voting in sort of one large unit, which we've had these debates over and over again. It wasn't long ago we were saying that the SDP permanent majority in Scotland was going to always force us into minority administrations, and it was fundamentally changing the nature of our politics. To go back through Neil Lawson columns in The Guardian for 15, 16 years, you'll find there is not a single problem that Britain has faced in the entire time that apparently would not be resolved by switching away from first past the post. It's something that people grab to. They think it's going to have this inherent change to the nature of our politics. And it doesn't. It doesn't for a relatively simple reason, which is sooner or later you've got to end up with someone in government who is going to be one coherent unit capable of voting through legislation. And that means that at some point the granularity and the differences in argument break down. The decision is where that breaks down. Does that break down when it comes down to a choice of the ballot box, or does it break down when it comes down to parties trying to form a coherent agenda between themselves? In our system, people understand very clearly that realistically there are two parties that are going to form a government, and they can choose not to vote for them if they don't want to. They can express their views in a range of different ways. I have people telling me they're going to vote Green because I was guaranteed to win, and therefore they could express a viewpoint in a slightly different direction. It's very difficult to see what sits underneath the curtain, which I think is part of the point that sort of Rob was making, actually. When you start looking at the differences in tactical voting, the fact that the Labour Party managed to get such a big majority on such a tiny percentage share of the vote, that is not a coincidence. That is the work of people like Morgan McSweeney who are very capable of their jobs, that are absolutely optimising where to get their support across the entire board and doing it far better than their opposing number in the Conservative Party. Actively ensuring that in all these different areas where there was a non-Labour opponent, the resources not going into those areas, so a non-Labour Conservative opponent, which is a better place to win, that there were not going to be any Labour people actively doing an awful lot to compromise it, even if we choose to run candidates in every single seat. Ignores the tactical voting by voters. Voters are very capable of knowing which party in their area has the best chance of shifting things one way or the other, and they vote on that basis. And so that masks within that percentage share of the vote actually what the government's overall share is. And I think we can be pretty clear that this election was one thing. What voters wanted more than the Labour government, what they wanted was to get rid of the Conservatives, and that's how they voted. People go into the ballot box understanding the nature of our democracy and voting on that basis. The fact that it doesn't tick all these other boxes doesn't mean that it's not still a democratic system. My vote in one area may matter less than another area, but part of the point of that whole impossibility theorem is, it is very hard to maintain that constituency link and preferences expressed in that system across all these different footprints. You're going to compromise one way or the other. And in our system, voters, when they went to vote on AV, decided that they wanted a simpler system that they could get their heads around. And at some level, we should probably take into account the fact that they've cast that particular vote. I will come back to this point though. I was challenged on the UK being a unitary system, and I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with Rob on this. Two reasons. One of which is Parliament in our system retains absolute sovereignty. So Parliament tomorrow could pass legislation overriding Scotland, and there was an attempt by the last government to do that. In fact, I think they actually did get ahead and do it in one bit of legislation. It is not well thought of. It creates political problems, but at any given point, the government in the UK could act as though there was no Scottish Parliament and things would function. The reality is that there's still a hell of a lot that is dependent upon within those areas from a strong central government. I don't like the fact that strong central government. I would much rather have some regional tier of government across England that make it viable. But so long as we're talking about a level of devolution, which so far means that only a sixth of the UK population has got that kind of tier of local administration, the overwhelming majority of the UK public in a state of chaos is going to suffer. And we've got some example of this during Brexit, during these periods where we had sort of unclear government in Westminster 2017 to 2019, that, you know, regardless of the fact that, you know, and this point that's been made around stability, you can get big swings one way or the other. You know, I might dislike the Conservative Party a lot. In fact, I've spent pretty much my entire life campaigning against them. But what was very clearly damaging for the country from 2016 through to 2019 was no clarity over where the country was going with Brexit. You know, that did far, far greater damage to the UK economy than if we had clarity. It's definitely going to happen. We're definitely going to leave Brexit. Now, I didn't want us to leave the European Union, but the reality is that period of time cost the UK one heck of a lot in investment. It does untold damage as a result to our public accounts, which we're now seeing in the impact on public services. Stability in the system offers clarity over direction, even if you don't like the direction. And it means that every other actor then can take decisions around that. It minimises the overall harm to the system. Having uncertainty, you know, just creates more chaos and more problems for countries. And it leaves you in a position where you can't really deal with the challenges of the day. And in a system that's as highly concentrated as ours, you know, that means people will suffer in a way that they do not suffer in most European states where you've got much more advanced levels of regional administration.
Thank you. I have many, many more questions that I'd like to ask, but we've also had some great questions being submitted by members of the audience. So I might come in back in with some of my questions in a bit. But Tom, do you want to reappear on our screens? Magically, it happens. There we go. And what questions do you have for us from the audience?
Great, thanks very much, Alan. And so I'll take these in groups of 3 at a time. So in the first group, we have an anonymous attendee asks, or says, much of the conversation has centered around the experience and fortunes of parties under different systems. And they ask, is it not more important that we reframe this debate around how it benefits the voter? And is the voter not best advantaged by having greater agency, equality, and representation? Another anonymous attendee asks, does the panel consider that the UK's experience of government between 2010 and 2024 supports the argument that single-party government is strong and stable, as David Cameron argued in 2015, and coalition weak and unstable? And then finally, another anonymous attendee, which I think is responding to some of Peter's opening remarks, asks, is it coherent to simultaneously praise First Past the Post for allowing parties to deliver their manifesto promises while also praising it for encouraging MPs to rebel against their party's policies?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Shall we start this round with Francis? Feel free to pick up any of the questions you wish. Don't feel you have to answer everyone.
Sure, no, I won't. Yeah, great questions. I mean, obviously, I felt like the first questioner maybe supports PR. And I think that was sort of indicative in this conversation. And actually, it's a point I wanted to make earlier. I can only wholeheartedly agree with the fact that it's very frustrating to me that actually a lot of the conversations about electoral systems are based around this idea of politics as a game. Now, of course, to some degree, it is a game. That's what representative electoral politics is. And you do have to have all the various machinations that Peter spoke about. But does that actually produce better politics? And in fact, do voters not actually feel more alienated from politics the more gamified it becomes? And the less clear it becomes that, you know, my vote for this particular policy and agenda and set of priorities and ideology is being represented in politics. And I just think we can step back from that. As a bunch of people who do work in politics and political nerds, I think from my experience anecdotally of talking to my friends and family about this, I think this idea that politics is just this game where you have to maximize the vote in all of these different constituencies, which, as Rob said, you know, leaves most of the country cold. 70% of votes don't change the result of the election. They might as well be put through a shredder for all that they actually change the makeup of Parliament. And the fact that people know, as Peter said, absolutely right, people know that they live in marginal or safe seats. I mean, I would argue that much more seats, there has been much more turn in the last few years, and so we're seeing more seats come into contestation, which can only be a good thing. But in fact, First Past the Post militates against that competition. And so the fact that people know that is, you know, you only have to look at the polling on this. Lots of people feel extremely depressed about living in safe seats. They say, my vote doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. this is a much bigger problem than just an electoral system. It's about this question of representative democracy in general. But my argument all the way along has been to say, as this first questioner kind of puts it, isn't it better to give voters more agency, more representation? And that is what PR is all about. I'd just like to add on that point of like the gamification, that the experience of the last election was, I also think, deeply troubling to a lot of candidates, not least within the Labour Party. Very few people know this, but the Labour Party, in order to pursue its small target strategy and really, really push these votes at the election, which it did to great success, but I would say at what cost, it did actually block a lot of Labour candidates from using its database and really told them they not only were they taken to other constituencies, which they felt were more winnable, in order to campaign. These were the candidates who'd been selected as their own local seat candidate, but also it punished them for campaigning in their own seat. Like, we're entering like levels of ridiculousness under first past the post that actually lots of voters feel in their waters, they feel in their bones about it, but actually lots of people don't know that this is the case. And that's kind of why I wrote this piece last year, which is called, you know, we shouldn't hate the player, but the player should hate the game. It's not about hating the parties that do this, but it is about saying the game is ridiculous and is rigged in a certain way to incentivize this kind of winning. Just very finally on this point about strong and stable, stability is something to then be definitely prized in a time which we're facing a lot of global churn and a lot of precarity. And I think a lot of what voters are saying across the political spectrum is, things are tough out there right now, and there is a lot of uncertainty at a time that, you know, it feels very precarious for our politics. And I just wish this argument that first past the post in the last 10, 15 years has done anything to preserve that sense of stability or to give voters a clear view about the direction of politics. I just think it needs to now die, as Rob was saying. I don't think there's really much evidence for that. And I think that's the feedback loop that you're seeing of an increasingly complex and challenging political landscape, both internationally and domestically. And we need a system that can be a bit more responsive to that. It wouldn't solve everything, but I think PR is that system.
Thank you, Francis. Peter, the second question there was perhaps particularly directed at you, the contrast between perhaps stability under coalition government between 2010 and 2015 and instability in the years from 2015 to 2024.
I think that's more to do with Brexit, to be honest, rather than issues within the party. It's essentially a remaking of the Conservative Party in a new image, and it's been a painful transition, and we're still seeing that playing out at this point, rather than the coalition being inherently stable. There were several points that almost broke down during that period of time. And, you know, let's not forget that David Cameron actually had to change the UK constitution to provide it with stability by removing sort of a majoritarian principle in terms of triggering a general election with a confidence vote. We had to have a supermajority to make that happen to prevent the Lib Dems being capable of walking out that coalition. So I wouldn't necessarily argue it was more stable without a certain amount of rigging in the system. Look, I mean, I'm going to assume most people on the call, frankly, probably lean towards PR. It's what I'm kind of used to. Most of the people who are interested. If you're not interested in sort of debate around it, you don't tend to go to a debate around PR, because why would you bother? You've already got a system that you prefer. But I've always preferred going to rooms where people disagree with me, because if I go to a room where everyone agrees with me, then the worst thing I can do is end up leaving with fewer people agreeing with me. Whereas if I go to a room with people who disagree with me, then I might actually persuade at least one person and then one from where I started. In terms of the point of focusing on voters rather than on parties, yeah, I agree. I mean, I said that at the start, that one of the big arguments that happens, and mostly this argument happens to the left, is trying to claim there's not going to ever be a Conservative government again as a result of implementing PR. And I think that's a fairly poor reason to try and go down that route, even if it doesn't actually stack up when you look at it. I do think there are higher principles, and some of those principles are higher than whether or not a voter feels that they've got agency or feels happy about the system. You know, the most fundamental basis of our state is to provide us with a certain amount of security. And in a system which is quite as heavily centralised as ours, you know, there are significant consequences to people's quality of life where you end up with something that's chaotic. And that means that you've got to ensure that the system that you're producing is something that's actually going to take care of people, in addition to ensuring that people have a form of representation through that system. So, you know, voters have a voice in our system, but it's not an exact voice necessarily. You know, and if we really want to elect our governments that way, then why bother having this system? Why not just call for a presidential system, where we can just vote directly for whoever we want to be our executive, rather than just messing around with Parliament as an electoral college. In terms of sort of strength and stability, I think I've touched upon already. But dealing with that last one about whether or not there's a coalition between stability and rebellion in terms of more MPs being inclined to rebel than previously and more stable government. No, I think there's a difference to what I was trying to say there compared to assuming that every MP is going to go out and rebel on every issue as a result of their electorate. The point I'm making is about representation. That if you do away with the constituency link, what you end up losing with is communities lose representation in the House of Commons. And I can provide you with a fairly good example of this during my time in office, in that I have the quarter of the global population of Chagosians living in Crawley. And I am probably the only MP who's said from the start that my only consideration is that they get to decide what happens in this process. I've been pretty outspoken in terms of my views of the Foreign Secretary and ministers about this issue in a way in which MPs wouldn't usually. But then with that number of voters in my constituency, there was a clear link between their issues and the issue that their local representative is probably going to take some interest in. I may well be, I will be voting against the treaty when it eventually comes up for a vote. I won't change the end result of that because the overwhelming majority of MPs will continue to support the party, but they don't lose out on a vote and a voice in Parliament as a result of not having that constituency link and not having that ability to essentially filter out candidates who don't think are particularly good candidates. You still end up with stability, you still end up with that large majority, but you actually get the voice of your area represented in the House of Commons.
Great, thank you. And there have been some comments in the Q&A that suggest you're definitely not alone in the room in that side of the argument. Rob.
Thank you, and yes, kudos to Peter for wanting to be in hostile rooms. It's an impulse that I often share. I think it makes for much more invigorating discussion. I think he's acquitted himself very well, and therefore given me lots to respond to. I want to pick up 2 points particularly, and I want to focus on higher principles because I agree with Peter. That's really where the debate should be taking place. And I want to pick up about the points about stability and coalitions, and then the point about voter representation. I think the point about stability and coalitions is, as Peter says, first past the post isn't the source of all evil. The same point can be made the other way around, which is that PR is not the source of all instability. In fact, many countries with PR systems have very stable governments that feature very clear policy making and actually a good deal more stability and continuity in policy making than our Westminster system does. And in fact, I would argue that the bargaining process of coalition that you get under a more proportional system is itself a virtue that many voters would value. It produces greater clarity because actually politics is always a bargain. Peter's just mentioned an example of bargaining he's doing within his party, but the bargain within a single party is often very opaque. Who understands exactly how things get into the Labour manifesto or don't? I mean, I literally spend years trying to figure that out, writing about it, and I struggle. The average voter certainly doesn't know. A bargaining process between parties is clear by design because the parties have a strong incentive to advertise their positions and the bargains that they're making and the trade-offs they're making. That's part of how coalition politics works. It produces more stable policy making because there's less abrupt change from one parliament to the next. It produces more restraint and protection against radicalism. One of the lines I've liked to use when I've been in hostile rooms, in particular of trade unionists talking about electoral reform, is that the reforms of Thatcherism would never have happened under a more proportional electoral system because the smaller parties that a Thatcherite government would have had to bargain with would not have enabled those policies to be pursued so far, so fast, with so much damage. If you want to sand off the rough edges of policy, then a bargaining system enables that. Then on the point about voter representation, I actually think this is really, really critical. I think this is probably, to my mind, the strongest argument, one of the reasons I've become more in favour of electoral reform over the past 10 years. If we go back to 2014, what happened in Scotland, no Scottish Labour MP saw it coming. Why did no Scottish Labour MP see it coming? Because most of them were not campaigning in their seats because their seats were safe. That was not by accident, that was by design. And I wouldn't criticise them for it. That was the right thing for them to do under this electoral system, but it meant they didn't know what was happening in their seats in 2014 or in 2015. Why were so many MPs taken by surprise by what happened in their constituencies in 2016 during the EU referendum? Same reason. By design, they were not talking to the constituents in their seats. Their parties were not talking to the constituents in their seats because that was not the system of dialogue with the electorate that would deliver them victory. So they didn't. Come to 2019, Labour Red Wall MPs didn't know what was going on in their seats by design. 2024, Labour MPs in Gaza in independent seats did not know what was going on in their seats by design. Tory MPs in the Blue Wall did not know what was going on in their seats by design. They did not have the local campaigning apparatus by design. This is McSweeneyism, and it is an electorally efficient way to win elections. It is also a very efficient way to marginalise the voice of an awful lot of voters and repeatedly be taken by surprise by the sentiments that are circulating in those electorates because you've got no intelligence system. If you introduce an electoral system that incentivizes talking to more sections of the electorate more of the time, you have a stronger link between governors and governed. The whole point of an electoral system is to design a strong and robust link between governors and governed, so information can flow in both directions. By design, the design of Linton Crosby, the design of Morgan McSweeney, the design of Peter Mandelson, the first past the post system does not deliver that. It incentivizes the opposite of that. That will never change, and actually isn't contingent on whether we have 5 parties or 4 parties or 3 parties. It is an inherent feature of the system that you focus on the few at the expense of the many, because if you don't, your competitors will, and they'll beat you. So if that is not a desirable quality of an electoral system, you have to find a different one.
Thank you, Rob. Let's go for another round of questions, and I'm going to encourage speedy answers in this round so that we can get through as much as we possibly can. So, Tom, what do you have for us?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So one question, which is sort of perhaps more from the perspective that Peter's coming from, asks, well, if first past the post gives disproportionate influence to the larger parties, is there a risk that proportional representation gives disproportionate influence to the smaller parties if they hold the balance of power in coalition negotiations? Then a question asks, if these electoral systems have different pros and cons and there are trade-offs involved, could part of the answer be to have a mix of different systems at different levels of our politics, perhaps by having more proportional representation at a local or regional level, or through an elected House of Lords? And then the final question that I've got down here is from an anonymous attendee again, and they have asked, should the government launch an independent national commission for electoral reform to look at the evidence on both sides of the debate that we're hearing today?
Fantastic. Thank you. Everyone's been quite bashful today and submitting anonymous questions, but they are great questions all the same. Peter, do you want to kick off first this round? And as I said, if everyone can try to keep things brief, then we might get some further questions at the end as well.
Actually, the last question, so I'll get to that point. First past the post is disproportionate, say to small, or would PR give more say to disproportionate, say to small parties? Yes. I mean, if you look at election results back to 45, you can't form a government out of any coalition of parties really without the Lib Dems forming part of it. So you end up in a situation where you essentially have a party that ranges from about 12% of the vote to 20% of the vote, never being out of office, as being apparently the will of the people being expressed democratically. Other institutions, I'm open to it. You know, the idea should be used at other levels. We experiment with a range of things. The impact to society is not so great in terms of stability if you lose that outside of the UK system. And there have been conversations about the House of Lords being done on that basis. We did have more of sub-national bodies being done on that basis. It's interesting that we're not bringing it back in for police and crime commission elections or mayoralties. I suspect that has much more to do with concerns over reform, managing to gather right-wing voters in northern bits of the country rather than the overall picture. And I think it's a fairly silly reason what's going on with it. In fact, frankly, my viewpoint, having chaired the working group of the LGA looking at the Elections Act, the entire thing needs to be revoked. It was purely one effort in trying to stitch up the electorate for the Conservative Party of the last election. Could I ask what the third question was?
Tom, do you want to go for it?
Yes, I absolutely can. It was about whether the government should launch an independent national commission for electoral reform to look at the evidence on both sides of this debate.
Well, I don't believe in election reform, so no. But no doubt.
Fair enough. Yeah. Rob.
I think there's quite a lot of agreement between me and Peter on this round of questions, actually. I do agree that most proportional systems would increase the influence of smaller parties, and that you can get scenarios where certain smaller parties are always in government and exercise disproportionate influence. I don't think that can be entirely engineered out of electoral reform. It is a trade-off. Do you want smaller parties to have no influence at all, despite getting lots of votes? Do you want to have them excessive influence, despite not getting more votes than the larger parties? And I do think things like the behaviour of parties, the political culture, the specifics of the electoral system can mitigate these effects. But I don't think, as I said at the beginning, I don't think we can pretend that there's only one true electoral system that avoids every possible cost or problem. So it's a judgment call, really. On different systems for different levels of government, yeah, let a thousand flowers bloom. I'm in favour of that. I actually think that's a good way of getting better understanding of what voters think are desirable electoral systems. We've actually gone a fair distance down that path already across the country as a whole, and I'd be in favour of going further. I completely agree. PCC and mayoral elections should go back to some sort of a more proportional electoral system. That would be a good first step. And I've also forgotten what the third question was. Oh, Royal Commission. Yeah, well, I mean, unlike Peter, I am in favour of electoral reform. So actually, I would be against it in the sense that I think it would just be used as a way to kick the thing into a long grass. And so actually, I would favour not going down that route, because I think it would just waste an awful lot of time, and it would be better for the parties to take control of the process and take responsibility for it, because they're the ones who have to implement it.
Francis?
Yeah, great. There is some agreement here. It's obviously definitely true. You can see it that it would disproportionate influence would swing the other way. I'd say a couple of things about that. One is that that's already happening on the first past the post. I mean, it's not like reform is not having quite a big influence on our politics right now. So that is happening, but I would say that is a disproportionate effect of first past the post. And it's back to Rob's point about where the agenda setting happens. All politics is compromise and about bargaining, and I would prefer to see it happen between parties. I think that's healthier. It gives the voters more of a say and influence over actually what happens, rather than within them, which, as Rob said earlier, is a bit of a closed shop, and you have no idea how it's happening, and it leaves a lot of people out in the cold. There's also a renegade argument there to say, in a slightly majoritarian system, which even proportional systems would be, in the sense of they give a kind of, it's proportional, but the majority still gets a majority of power. It gives a space for other ideas and other parties to be taken into consideration. And maybe it's okay to dial up the influence of those outside voices in a truly representative democracy. And as Peter said earlier, we'll benefit from a bit of contestation and friction in our politics. And that's very good for our national conversation. I would say on the mix of different electoral systems, yes, although what you do hear from a lot of voters is things are very confusing at this stage. People don't know where power lies. I think that's largely a product of also our completely mess of a devolution system. So people don't have completely different. If you fix devolution and make it a bit more transparent and a bit more coherent, then I think you can have different electoral systems. But what I would say is, well, let's put it up for contest then. Let's, on a meta level, have the voters choose which voting system they should choose. And just a funny anecdote from the Irish Citizens' Assembly, which looked at the voting systems to some degree, is that they then made the Irish participants choose their dinner options on the basis of a different voting system every evening. And they did not choose first past the post. It turns out that kind of discerning nature of PR is something that gave more people more of what they wanted. It's also worth pointing out that my fellow electoral reformers wouldn't like me not to say this, that UK is the only country in Europe, apart from Belarus, who has continued with this first past the voting system, and there is not yet a country, I stand to be corrected if this is not true, but who has chosen first past the post in the modern era. So it is unpopular, but let's put it to a contest, why not? And then very finally, this point about National Commission. So glad somebody asked that. I suspect it might just be a fellow electoral reformer in the question. Yes, that is the APPG's main ask. I take what Rob said, but I also think that this is an opportunity to come back to what Peter said earlier, having a national conversation. I don't take this point that voters don't care about this. If you look at Brexit, which is one of the most animating conversations in UK recent history, obviously there's a lot going on in Brexit, but if you look at the poll on the day of the Brexit referendum of leavers, people who are voting leave, their number one reason was UK laws should be made in the UK. That is a constitutional question about sovereignty and where power lies. Voters care about this, and to suggest otherwise is, I think, not fair to voters, and is not taking voters seriously enough. And I just think conversations about power right now would be really important. It would galvanise a different group of people. Reform, you've seen, have kind of tapped into a group of people who've not voted before. I think that's really important for all of us to take seriously. I would say the biggest problem in our politics right now is apathy, alienation, and disaffection, not actually who is in power. And that, I think, could be answered by having a national conversation as part of a national commission.
Fantastic. Time is very short, but let me ask one final question to each of you and try to be very brief in your response. So, Francis and Rob, is reform actually going to happen? Is there a route to it? That is a question that has been asked by a member of the audience. But before we get to that, Peter, I know your answer to that question is no, so don't bother with that. But we do see a crisis in confidence in democracy at the moment. We see really low turnout in recent elections. We see lots of the problems that Francis and Rob have been highlighting. You've argued that electoral reform is not a solution. What alternatives would you offer instead? So, Rob, Peter first, and then Francis and Rob.
I think people want better quality of life. I think that's the fundamental. Is most people will put up with most systems so long as it's delivering for them in terms of the things that they need when they need them. You know, confidence in the UK, or at least the level of scepticism around the system, really seemed to kick off with the financial crash, when the people who seemed to understand and be in control of everything, as it turned out, were asleep at the tiller, and a load of people were doing fairly corrupt things in the system. You know, it creates a level of distrust, and we then see that amplified with things like COVID later down the road. That every time expertise raises concerns around things, or people's experience doesn't match up, you end up with a big development in cynicism, or increase in cynicism. You know, lots of people live very happily in totalitarian systems for a very long time. I don't think it's a positive thing, but the reality is that people's confidence in their system, and people's willingness to sustain or remain in that system, is about ensuring that their needs get met. And that really, in the UK, means about trying to get back to some sensible level of economic growth, ensuring that the growth is distributed in a way that means the majority of the population feel that they're treated fairly, and that they've got better prospects in the future, ensuring that they've got decent quality public services. In fact, all research from the Spirit level, previously back 10, 20 odd years ago, something like that, by the epidemiologists, showed that the things that had the most impact in terms of people's quality of life was having a more equal society, and having better.
Sorry, got to be brief, but that was really great. Thank you. Francis?
Is it going to happen? Yes, it's going to happen. It's a question of time. That you can only you can only hold on for so long, and eventually externalities shift. And I think what's really notable about the last 5 years, yes, we've been having this debate for a long time, but all of the things Rob and I have mentioned today mean that the context is right for it. And a couple of really important things to just bear in mind: the Labour membership voted for it in 2022. It was the biggest vote at Labour Party conference historically, and this was amidst Liz Truss and everything else happening. The Labour members still identified the system as a problem within all of this, and understood all the things that Rob's saying about it disincentivizing the right kind of politics, and cutting that feedback with the voters. You're still seeing, just pick on what Peter said, you're seeing a huge lack of confidence in the system in general. I think that's extremely dangerous. I think for democracy to continue and to renew itself, it needs to continually change with the times and adapt to what voters want and need. And I think, just to end on a more positive note, we're living in an era where citizens are educated, they're informed, they're engaged in the idea of politics, but they feel their system lets them down. And something that I hear politicians saying is that there is this disaffection. Well, yes, but let's look at the root of it. It's that our system and our structures and our politics do not match an age which is increasingly complex, in which people demand a greater voice and greater participation. And there's lots of things that we can do about that, and PR is just one of them.
Fantastic. And final, very brief word to Rob.
Do I think it will happen? Yes, I do. 3 reasons. Firstly, as already mentioned, I think there's lots of states of the world in the future where the smaller parties and Labour need to bargain, and the smaller parties will all favour PR. Secondly, as Francis has mentioned, Labour internally have moved in a pro-PR direction in a quite pronounced way in the past 5 years. Members, MPs, associated trade unions, all coming out in favour of reform. So there's pressure building within the Labour tent, as it were. And thirdly, it's not a binary. As Peter himself has mentioned, this is a system that could be tried, or reforms could be tried at multiple levels of government. We're seeing constitutional reform in terms of devolution within England, which I also welcome. And that will probably be the start of a process that will gather internal momentum. I think there's only really one way in which we won't see any significant electoral reform in the next decade, and that's if we get a reform majority. And ironically, the only way we get a reform majority is under first past the post.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. This has been a great conversation. Before I do thanks properly, let me just remind everyone that this is the last session for the conference today, but we continue with 3 more sessions tomorrow. The first of those starts at 11 a.m. when we'll be discussing the rule of law with the chair of the House of Commons Justice Committee, Andy Slaughter MP, the former Attorney General, Baroness Victoria Prentice, and the legal academic and presenter, Joelle Grogan. So do join us for that, and you'll be able to join again using the same link as today, just before that session is due to begin. So thank you first to everyone in the audience for attending, especially to all of you who submitted questions. Sorry we didn't manage to get to all of them, but let me especially thank our terrific speakers on this panel, Francis Foley, Peter Lamb and Rob Ford. You've all been tremendously insightful. Thank you also to Tom Fleming for answering the fielding the questions, and Ed and Rowan behind the scenes for making everything run smoothly. Goodbye for now, and we look forward very much to seeing you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.